Hello all. So today we're going to be looking at D3.3, which is kidney, and we want to be able to explain how the kidney works to maintain homeostasis. This is going to be looking at continuity and change. So how are we changing blood osmolarity, and then also how does blood osmolarity stay the same? And we'll be looking at pages 728 to 735 in the Oxford textbook. So the main jobs of the kidney, a few different things. Going to be osmoregulation, how much water is in the bloodstream. That's going to affect cellular pressure. Also ensuring that nutrients such as amino acids, glucose, ions, they're reabsorbed from our blood so that they're not coming out in the urine. Removal of urea, so that's going to be metabolic waste breakdown generated from the breakdown of amino acids. Urea is a byproduct of the breakdown of amino acids, and we need to remove that, which is why the word urine has part of the word urea in it. And then the components that we need to know for the kidney, the functional components, are all in this structure, which is called the nephron. And there are millions of nephrons inside your kidney. And your kidney is made up of the cortex, which is the outside layer of the kidney, the medulla, which are these little pie pieces, the pelvis, which is this inside piece that connects the medulla to the ureter, and the ureter leads to the bladder, and then the renal, which means kidney, renal artery, and a renal vein. And so inside the kidney are millions of these nephrons, and these nephrons are going to filter our blood at this point. This is the glomerulus here. Then the filtrate, the stuff that's coming out of the blood, is going to go into the Bowman's capsule. That's this section here. Travel through the proximal convoluted tubule, which is here, which is where ions are reabsorbed. Pass through the loop of Henle, which is down here. That's where water is reabsorbed. Through the distal convoluted tubule, which is where more ions and glucose are reabsorbed. And then lastly, through the collecting duct, which is where more water is absorbed. So when we are thinking about kidney functionality, we need to know that blood enters through the renal artery, and it's filled with waste products like urea, and it's going to be filtered and then cleaned, and that blood is going to return to the body via the renal vein. So this here is a nephron, as we saw on the last slide. The renal artery has more oxygen than the renal vein, but also more urea. Salt and water can be filtered out of the blood, so that means they're going to go out of the kidney back into the bloodstream. So they're not going to come out in the urine often, but they can come out in the urine. They're just not excretory products. So they didn't result from metabolic breakdown of things. You might just have too much water in your body or too much salt. And then the cortex here, which is the outer layer of the kidney, that's where the glomerulus, this section, the proximal convoluted tubule and the distal convoluted tubule are. So this whole section here is in the cortex. And then this part, the collecting duct and the loop of Henle, which are both water reabsorption areas, are in the medullas. So what's going on at the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus? So this is a structure of the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus. And what's happening is we have, so this component here is the glomerulus, this is the capsule, and this is the capillary space. So we have blood coming in here, and it's going to come in through the afferent arteriole, and the afferent arteriole is quite wide, and it's going to go out through the efferent arteriole. So it comes in going really fast, but then there's like a traffic jam because the efferent arteriole is really narrow. So the blood gets stuck in this little twistiness of blood vessel called the glomerulus that is inside the Bowman's capsule. And it causes a lot of pressure inside the glomerulus, which is then going to squeeze filtrate out of the capillary into the space so that it can go into the Bowman's capsule. And the Bowman's capsule is then going to transfer that liquid that got squeezed out of the blood vessels to the proximal convoluted tubule. Things that are staying in the blood will be blood proteins and then red blood cells. But there are a lot of spaces here in the glomerulus that allow for other things to come out. So there's about 100 times more tissue fluid. That's the liquid leaking out of the capillary that's forming. And that's because of that high pressure situation. And then there's going to be things like salts and ions that are going to get squeezed out as well from the capillary into the Bowman's capsule. But the fenestrations, which are, if you know the word fenêtre, that in French, that means window. So like the little spaces are only big enough so that smaller molecules or very, very small molecules can get out, and ions, and then water. So the filter structure is going to include the basement membrane. That's this pink thing here. And it's going to support the wall of the capillary with this non-cellular gel. But it's going to prevent plasma proteins from leaving the blood because it's charged, and so too are the plasma proteins. Podocytes, that's this blue stuff up here, is going to stabilize the capillary glomerulus boundary. And it's going to also have these, so the foot processes are these things here. That's the stabilizing component. And then it has tiny little gaps that are going to prevent small molecules from filtering. That's called ultrafiltration. So all of this is happening at that one little space at the start of the nephron, the glomerulus, and the Bowman's capsule. So then we're moving into the proximal convoluted tubule, and the proximal convoluted tubule's purpose is to reabsorb stuff that we still need back in our blood. So all glucose and amino acids plus 80% of our water is going to be reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. It has really high surface area to volume ratio due to microvilli and villi that are inside the tubule. And the different ways that this transport is happening is, so this is inside the tubule here. You can see that these are the villi, the little finger-like projections that are going to increase the surface area. And then this is the blood vessel here. So sodium ions are getting transported out through active transport. And then chloride ions are going to be attracted by the charge of the sodium ions on the outside. Sodium is actually working as a co-transporter with amino acids and glucose. So what's happening here is that the sodium ions are building up in this section, and it allows glucose to be moved out of the proximal convoluted tubule. And it's functioning the same way for the for amino acids that are also being transported. And then water, there's forming a high solute concentration outside of the proximal convoluted tubule. And so as a byproduct, water is going to move out of the proximal convoluted tubule via osmosis. So that's the glomerulus there that we talked about 2 slides ago. This is the proximal convoluted tubule, which we just talked about. And now we're moving into the loop of Henle. So this is the entire nephron here. And the loop of Henle is a water absorption structure. And so the concentration gradient of the medulla of the kidney is going to be very, very high. So this is deep into the kidney in the central area of the kidney. And this is up here at the cortex. And so you can see that the solute concentration at 1200 versus 300 is quite a lot higher into the medulla of the kidney. And so this concentration gradient allows for reabsorption of water. And so what's going on here is this section, this is called the ascending loop of the loop of Henle, is going to be pumping sodium ions out of the liquid. And the ascending loop section is permeable to sodium, but it's not permeable to water. So water cannot follow sodium out at this point. The only place that water can follow is on the descending loop. So because you're going to end up with high sodium concentration in the tissue surrounding the ascending loop, the water in the descending loop is going to move into that salty area. And the descending loop is permeable to water, but not to sodium. This is called a countercurrent multiplier. And so what that means is this section is doing one thing and that section is doing another thing. And it allows for a high concentration gradient to be built up at the bottom of that section. And so because one section is permeable to water and one is permeable to sodium chloride, that allows for a very high concentration gradient to form deep into the medulla, which allows for high amounts of osmotic movement out of this tubule. And organisms that live in the desert, for example, actually have longer loops of Henle so that they can develop even a higher concentration gradient, which then allows them to reabsorb even more water. So this osmotic concentration of the blood is regulated by the hypothalamus, which controls homeostasis in our body. So next we're moving into the collecting duct. And so that's over here. This is going to be a water reabsorption area too. Once the the filtrate solution comes out of the loop of Henle, it goes into the distal convoluted tubule, and more water is reabsorbed at this point, as well as some ions, using the same strategies that were used in the proximal convoluted tubule. But then the collecting duct is the last water absorption location. And so aquaporins are channel proteins that change permeability to water of structures, and so of cells. And so the collecting duct has a fair amount of aquaporins. If there's too little water in the blood, the hypothalamus is going to release a hormone called ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which triggers more aquaporins to be created in the collecting duct, and that will facilitate more movement of water out of the collecting duct into the tissue, into the medulla, around the in the tissues of the kidney. And all of this stuff that's being reabsorbed, actually, if we go back many slides to the first or second slide that we looked at, there's a bunch of capillaries surrounding all of this. So all of those ions are going into the tissue and then they're moving back into the bloodstream that is surrounding all of this. And so lots of water can be reabsorbed in the collecting duct. The fluid moves quite slowly to allow reabsorption of water. And at the end of the collecting duct, urine is formed and sent by the renal pelvis. That's that central location in the kidney, and it's going to go out through the ureter to the bladder. And vice versa, if there's too much there's too much water in the tissue fluid that's moving through the nephron. If that blood solute concentration is really low, meaning there's a lot of water in that tissue fluid, then relatively little water will be reabsorbed. It's going to maintain a high flow rate, and then lots of urine would be produced. So just one quick note, kind of not related to kidneys, but yes, related to homeostasis, is that your body cannot produce enough blood. It doesn't have enough blood in your body to provide all of your organs with maximal potential needs for blood. So as a result, there's a prioritization of how much blood is going to which organs in specific circumstances. And so this is achieved by the contraction or relaxation of arterioles, which are small arteries. And so relaxation of circular muscles in these arterioles is going to cause vasodilation, meaning the tube gets bigger, and that's going to increase blood flow to an area or an organ location. And the opposite of vasodilation would be vasoconstriction. Additionally, sometimes there's direct pathways. These are called shunt vessels that are going to direct blood specifically from one arteriole to a venule instead of passing it all the way through all of the capillaries and then into a venule. So this is just a quicker pathway for blood to then circulate to different locations. So this image here is an image. The left-hand side is if you're resting, and the right-hand side is if you're physically exercising quite heavily. And the text here summarizes what's going on, but you can see here 88% of your blood, if you're working hard physically, is going to be going to your skeletal muscle, 3% to your brain, 2% to your kidneys, 1% to your digestive system. So your kidneys and your digestive system can kind of be on pause while other things are going on, especially if you're highly physically active, which is why often if you go to the gym and you're exercising and you didn't maybe eat very recently, you don't feel very hungry while you're exercising, but then as soon as you stop exercising, you're like, oh my goodness, I'm ravenous. So your digestive system has then reactivated and is telling you, you're really hungry. Meanwhile, if you were just resting or you were sleeping, quite a lot of blood would be going to your brain. But then if you were sleeping, not very much blood would actually be going to your muscles because you're not moving very much when you're sleeping. If you had eaten before bed, then a fair amount of blood would be going to your digestive system. Some of it would be also in your kidneys because you do always have to pee when you wake up. So that means your kidneys are working. So to summarize, osmoregulation is the job of the kidney and removal of urea. The kidney does this by producing a filtrate at the glomerulus, and no proteins or red blood cells are going into the Bowman's capsule, but yes, salt, glucose, and urea are going to go into the Bowman's capsule and then onwards to the proximal convoluted tubule. The proximal convoluted tubule and then the distal convoluted tubule, both are reabsorbing salt, glucose, amino acids, and water. And those reabsorbed components are going to go back into the bloodstream. So you can see that there's a bunch of capillaries surrounding, actually you can't really see it here, but there's a blood flow vessel here, and there's a bunch of capillaries surrounding each nephron. The loop of Henle is going to be reabsorbing water, as will the collecting duct. And not all of your organs get maximum blood flow all of the time. Your body prioritizes what is needed based on what you're doing. Okay, that's all for this one.